Welcome back to the Talking Ketamine podcast. This is episode 71, Ketamine and Hypnotherapy.
What if we could combine the biological, brain-resetting power of ketamine with the gentle, guided focus of hypnotherapy to unlock lasting mental health breakthroughs? Today, we are exploring a new study on ketamine-augmented hypnotherapy, looking at how this dual approach disrupts rigid, negative patterns in the brain and opens it a window for deep creative healing. Let's find out how it works.
Imagine walking into a clinic and the part of your brain that just automatically argues with the therapist, that little voice that insists you are fundamentally broken or that things will never change. Imagine that part is just chemically anesthetized.
Right, just completely taken offline.
Exactly. Your primary defense mechanisms are just offline, but without actually putting you to sleep.
Yeah, you're still awake, still aware.
Right. And if you're listening to this and you happen to be someone who has hit a wall with standard treatments, that concept alone sounds like an impossible luxury.
Oh, absolutely. It sounds like magic for a lot of people.
It really does, because if you're part of that group who has exhausted the traditional playbook, trying multiple SSRIs, SNRIs, years and years of standard talk therapy without any real relief, that profound exhaustion, that feeling of just being completely stuck.
Yeah, it's a very specific kind of burnout.
It is. It can feel like you were trying to fix a crumbling structural foundation in a house by just applying a fresh coat of paint to the living room walls.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. The paint looks nice, but the house is still sinking.
Exactly. The core architecture of the suffering just remains completely untouched.
And, the traditional psychiatric model has long relied on that trial and error approach. It often aims to blunt the symptoms rather than actually rewrite the underlying pathology.
Just kind of masking the pain.
Right. So a patient might cycle through medications for a decade, and the needle barely moves. Because standard therapies are essentially trying to negotiate with a defense system that simply refuses to yield.
It's just locked down.
Exactly. So our focus today is really unpacking a specific clinical protocol that bypasses those hardened defenses entirely.
Which is so exciting to talk about.
It really is a paradigm shift. We're looking at what happens when you use a biological catalyst to pry open a highly specific, highly plastic window in the brain.
And then you immediately introduce a specialized psychological guide, right?
Precisely. You introduce the guide to essentially renovate the structure while the concrete is still wet.
I love that visual. But to really grasp why that specific combination is so necessary, I think we first have to examine the trap itself.
Right. The reason people get stuck in the first place.
Yeah. Because the reason standard therapies bounce off treatment-resistant patients, it isn't a lack of willpower. It's not like you aren't trying hard enough.
No, not at all. It's biological.
Right. It comes down to how the human brain fundamentally operates as a predictive engine. Because evolutionarily speaking, your brain's primary goal is not to keep you happy.
Nope. Its goal is to keep you alive.
Keep you alive.
Exactly. And it accomplishes that by ruthlessly minimizing uncertainty. Because out in the wild, uncertainty is essentially a proxy for danger.
Yeah, the metabolic cost of processing brand new, unpredictable information every single second, it's just too high. The brain can't sustain that kind of energy output.
So it takes shortcuts.
Exactly. To conserve energy and avoid constant threat assessment, your brain builds routines. It hardwires neural pathways for, everything from driving a car to interpreting a social cue, allowing those processes to just run automatically in the background.
It's the ultimate energy saver mode.
Right. And this background processing, this baseline state of human consciousness, it's heavily mediated by what neuroscientists call the default mode network.
The DMN.
The DMN, yeah. And in a healthy system, the DMN is an incredibly efficient manager. It's the network that handles self-reflection, daydreaming, autobiographical memory. It basically lets your mind wander safely.
But in someone dealing with chronic depression or severe anxiety or PTSD, that autopilot manager basically goes rogue, doesn't it? Completely rogue. It becomes hyperactive and deeply, deeply rigid.
So it traps the individual in these tightly wound negative feedback loops.
Yeah.
The autopilot just keeps looping the same self-referential narratives. Things like, I am not safe, or I am unlovable, or every outcome will be a disaster.
Constant catastrophic thinking.
Right. And for anyone listening who has experienced this, I think it is so crucial to understand that it does not just feel like a passing bad mood.
No, it feels entirely physical.
It really does. It feels physical. It is, it's like a cauliflower fractal growing in your mind.
I'm glad you brought up the fractal metaphor because it maps beautifully onto the actual synaptic biology here.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, When we look at how habits of thought are formed in the brain, it all comes down to Hebb's law.
Okay, remind me what that is again.
Basically, neurons that fire together wire together.
Right, right. So a single negative thought about your self-worth, it doesn't just stay isolated.
Exactly. Through repetition, it branches.
So it attaches to your career performance, and then it branches into your romantic relationships, it creeps into your daily habits.
Yep, and as it grows, the pattern just repeats itself at every single level, getting smaller, denser, and more rigid until you are just trapped inside this hardened psychological structure.
And you can't just casually slice through a dense, hardened fractal like that with, a generic positive affirmation.
No, you really can't. The structural reality of those synapses literally prevents it. The neural pathways supporting those negative loops have been physically reinforced millions of times over years, sometimes decades.
They become biological highways?
Exactly. They are myelinated, highly efficient highways for negative thought, and the DMN fiercely defends this structure.
Because to the primitive survival centers of the brain, predictable misery is always preferred over unpredictable change.
That's a profound way to look at it, but it's true.
Yeah.
The brain essentially decides, well, I have a roadmap for depression. The physiological state feels awful, but it's a known variable.
Right. Survival is guaranteed. Changing the structure introduces the unknown, which triggers intense resistance. Is the DMN essentially an evolutionary survival mechanism to keep you safe from uncertainty that simply overstays its welcome and becomes a prison?
Yes, that is exactly what it is. It's a protective shell that turns into a cage.
Okay, but I have to push back on this framing just a little bit, though.
Sure, go ahead.
A lot of neuroscientists and philosophers argue that the default mode network isn't just some faulty autopilot we can blame all our problems on. I mean, it is frequently described as the literal seat of the ego.
True. It's strongly linked to our sense of self.
Right. It's the core of our human self-awareness. So if this network is fundamentally who we are, and we are talking about chemically shutting it down to break that cauliflower fractal,
Yeah.
aren't we risking severe depersonalization? Isn't it dangerous to intentionally dissolve the self like that?
That's a really vital distinction to make, and it's a very common concern. But we aren't talking about permanently lesioning the DMN or completely destroying the ego forever.
Okay, so it's temporary.
Exactly. The clinical objective here is a temporary therapeutic suspension. You see, when the DMN is hyperactive in a severely depressed patient, the ego, or the self it has constructed, is fundamentally pathological.
It's a broken model.
Right. It's a self-model defined almost entirely by trauma, limitation, and fear. So by temporarily taking it offline, we aren't destroying the patient's identity.
Or uncoupling them from a pathological self-model.
Exactly. We are giving the central nervous system a brief, profound respite from its own internal tyranny so it can finally recalibrate.
Wow. Okay, and the mechanism for forcing that recalibration brings us to the first half of this combined protocol we're talking about today. Ketamine.
Yes, the biological key.
Right. But I really want to move beyond the generic explanation you hear in the media that it just, resets the brain.
Yeah, that phrase gets thrown around a lot.
It does. So
Well-
what is actually happening under the hood? When a patient receives this treatment, how exactly does the chemical disrupt that rigid cauliflower fractal?
Well, unlike classic antidepressants like SSRIs, which, work on the serotonin system over a period of weeks, or classical psychedelics that target the serotonin 2A receptors, ketamine works entirely differently. It targets the glutamate system.
Okay. And glutamate is?
Glutamate is the most abundant excitatory neurotransmitter in the human brain.
So it's basically the gas pedal.
Yes. And biologically, ketamine acts as an NMDA receptor antagonist.
Meaning it blocks those receptors?
Exactly. It specifically binds to and blocks NMDA receptors, and it primarily does this on GABAergic inhibitory interneurons.
Okay, wait, let me make sure I follow. So if GABA usually acts as the brain's braking system, keeping neural activity tightly regulated and constrained, ketamine is essentially taking the foot off the brake.
Precisely that. By inhibiting the inhibitors, ketamine triggers a massive rapid surge of glutamate.
A sudden flood of excitatory neurotransmitters.
Right. And this sudden flood then activates a totally different set of receptors called AMPA receptors.
Okay, AMPA receptors.
Yeah. And the activation of those AMPA receptors sets off this incredibly complex intracellular signaling cascade, specifically involving the mTOR pathway that leads directly to the rapid release of BDNF.
Ah, brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
You got it.
Which is essentially miracle grow for the brain, right?
That's the perfect analogy. BDNF is the biological fertilizer that allows new dendritic spines to grow and existing synapses to rapidly alter their shape and their connectivity.
So the sudden availability of this fertilizer induces a state of really profound neuroplasticity.
Huge neuroplasticity. At the network level, this corresponds to a dramatic increase in brain entropy.
Entropy. So chaos.
Good chaos, though. The rigid, synchronized firing of the default mode network completely breaks down, and the brain enters this highly flexible, disorganized, but incredibly plastic state.
So the concrete of those hardened neural pathways is essentially turned back into wet cement.
Exactly. Wet cement.
You know, hearing the word entropy or chaos applied to the brain, I mean, that might sound terrifying to someone already battling severe anxiety.
Oh, for sure. It sounds like losing control.
Right. But the lived experience of this entropy isn't like falling into a chaotic blender. It is more like walking through a massive mansion where you've spent your entire life restricted to a cramped front hallway.
I like that.
Yeah. And without ketamine, the rooms containing your deepest traumas, but also the rooms holding your suppressed creativity, your joy, your peace, they're all dead-bolted.
Because the DMN keeps them locked.
Right. The DMN keeps those doors locked for your quote-unquote protection. But ketamine floods the system with BDNF, turns down the DMN, and simply unlocks every single door in the mansion.
The rigid walls just melt away.
Exactly. And patients describe this overwhelming sensation of sudden, total access to their own mind.
Because the self-models that you rigidly hold onto are suddenly malleable. The boundaries dissolve.
If ketamine increases chaos or entropy in the brain, wouldn't that feel terrifying and overwhelming for a patient who is already suffering from severe anxiety?
Well, the answer to why it doesn't cause a massive panic attack lies in ketamine's unique pharmacological profile. You see, it's a dissociative anesthetic.
So it has a built-in biological buffer.
Exactly. As it increases entropy and opens all those locked doors you mentioned, it simultaneously modulates the connection between the limbic system, which processes raw emotion and fear, and the higher cortical areas.
It separates the feeling from the thought.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
It uncouples the sensory input of a memory from its emotional weight.
Wow. So you can walk into that locked room in the mansion and look directly at a deeply rooted fear or a really traumatic memory, but you are completely shielded from the visceral, crushing physical anxiety that usually accompanies it.
That's exactly right. You become a perfectly calm, detached observer of your own mind.
That sounds incredibly peaceful.
It's a paradoxical state, really. The patient is more vulnerable and open than they have ever been, but simultaneously they are more protected.
So you get to examine the architecture of your own suffering from a safe distance without actually being trapped inside the fractal.
Right. It provides the absolute ideal biological environment for profound psychological change.
But here is the critical pivot in the protocol. Because having the doors open and the concrete wet, that is not a cure in itself.
No, it's just an opportunity.
Exactly. If you wander around this newly opened mansion with absolutely no map and no direction, it can be deeply disorienting. And more importantly, the biological effects of ketamine are temporary.
Very temporary. Eventually the drug is metabolized.
Right. The BDNF levels drop, the DMN powers back up, and if you haven't done anything to actively change the landscape while the concrete was wet, it's just going to dry right back into the exact same cauliflower shape it was in before.
And you are highlighting the tragic limitation of ketamine monotherapy right there.
When they just use the drug alone.
Exactly. When clinics rely solely on the biological intervention without any psychological integration, patients often get a beautiful, dramatic lift in their mood.
The heavy blanket of depression lifts for a bit.
Because the brain is highly plastic, yes, but neuroplasticity is completely agnostic.
What do you mean by agnostic?
It doesn't inherently know how to heal you. It just makes the brain changeable. If the patient goes right back to their unexamined life, their familiar stressful environment, and all their old behavioral patterns, the brain will just follow the path of least resistance.
So within a few weeks or months,
It reorganizes itself right back into the familiar, depressed structure.
which is exactly why the biological key of ketamine requires the psychological guide of hypnotherapy.
Yes, they are two halves of a necessary whole.
It's like if ketamine is the rototiller breaking up the hard, compacted soil of the mind, hypnotherapy is the deliberate process of planting new seeds.
That's a brilliant way to frame it.
But the choice of hypnotherapy here is fascinating to me.
Why is that?
Why specifically hypnotherapy? Why couldn't you just do traditional cognitive behavioral therapy or talk therapy while the ketamine is active?
It seems counterintuitive, right? Especially since CBT is considered the gold standard for restructuring thoughts.
Exactly. Why hypnosis instead of CBT?
Well, you have to remember what state the brain is in under ketamine. Cognitive behavioral therapy relies entirely on explicit memory and the executive function of the logical mind.
Right, the rational part.
Yes. In a CBT session, the therapist identifies a cognitive distortion, asks you to examine the evidence, and expects you to logically debate and restructure the thought.
You're arguing with your own logic.
But under ketamine, the default mode network and the prefrontal cortex, the exact networks responsible for logical debate and narrative reasoning, they are completely downregulated.
Oh, so they aren't even online to do the work.
Exactly. Trying to do CBT during a ketamine session is like trying to have a complex legal negotiation with someone who is actively deep in a dream.
That sounds impossible.
It is. The logical faculties simply aren't home to take the meeting.
The brain is speaking a completely different language in that entropic state, isn't it?
It really is.
It isn't communicating in spreadsheets and logic and rational arguments. It is communicating in raw emotions, symbols, and metaphors. It is a deeply subconscious state.
And clinical hypnotherapy is natively fluent in that exact language.
It speaks metaphor.
Yes. It does not attempt to argue with the conscious mind. It bypasses the critical faculty entirely.
Because the critical faculty is asleep anyway.
Right. By inducing a state of focused attention and deep physical relaxation, the hypnotherapist speaks directly to the subconscious. They use symbolic imagery and open-ended suggestions, allowing the patient to integrate new ideas without triggering any logical defense mechanisms.
It is so much gentler than the public perception of hypnosis.
Oh, definitely.
A lot of people still picture swinging pocket watches or, a stage trick where you lose control and cluck like a chicken.
Right, the Hollywood version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in this clinical setting, it is entirely collaborative. It actually makes me think of the myth of Daedalus.
Oh, the Greek myth.
Yeah.
Oh.
So Daedalus builds wings of wax and feathers so he and his son Icarus can escape their prison, which is much like a patient trying to escape the prison of their own mind. But before they take off, Daedalus gives very specific instructions. He says, "Do not fly too low, or the dampness of the sea will weigh down your feathers and you will drown."
Sinking into the depths.
Exactly. That's the equivalent of sinking into the heavy, crushing depths of a depressive spiral. But also, do not fly too high, or the heat of the sun will melt the wax and you will fall.
Right. Getting overwhelmed.
Yeah, that represents the overwhelming burning intensity of pure panic or confronting raw trauma too quickly. So Daedalus tells him, you must fly the middle path.
A safe, medium cruising altitude.
Exactly. And that is precisely what the hypnotherapist does for a patient under ketamine.
They act as the navigator.
Right. They don't force you into the blazing sun to get burned by confronting raw trauma aggressively. And they don't let you sink into the sea of apathy. They use verbal cues and imagery to gently calibrate your altitude.
That's a really powerful image.
They provide a safe framework so that your highly plastic, fertilizer-rich brain can organically reorganize itself. They aren't forcing a specific realization on you. They are just planting a seed in the fresh soil and letting your own subconscious cultivate the solution.
And the timing of this integration is really the defining factor of the study's success.
Because they do it while the concrete is wet.
Exactly. The clinicians are delivering these target-oriented metaphorical suggestions at the precise neurobiological moment when the synapses are most receptive to structural change.
That's incredible.
They are leveraging those glutamate and BDNF surges we talked about to physically encode the hypnotherapy into the brain's architecture.
Okay, so let's look at the actual clinical outcomes of this pairing. Because the theory is fascinating, but does it work?
Let's get into the data.
Yeah. So the recent observations tracked 89 patients undergoing this specific ketamine-augmented hypnotherapy protocol.
Yes, 89 patients.
And for you listening, a cohort of 89 patients is actually a really robust sample size for this kind of specialized, time-intensive modality.
It absolutely is.
And these were individuals dealing with severe, entrenched depression and anxiety, the exact population that has historically been the hardest to treat.
The ones with the deepest, most rigid cauliflower fractals.
Right. So, to quantify the results, the researchers relied on validated psychiatric metrics. Primarily, they were tracking the drops in the PHQ-9 depression scores.
The standard metric for depression severity.
Exactly. And what they observed following the combined protocol was striking.
Truly remarkable. Across the patient cohort, there were highly significant rapid reductions in both depression and anxiety.
Patients whose minds had been locked in those rigid loops for years were suddenly achieving profound clinical remission.
But, the immediate drop in scores is somewhat expected with ketamine alone.
Right, you get that initial mood lift regardless.
Exactly. The critical piece of this data is the longevity.
Because we know ketamine monotherapy often leads to a relapse curve, right? Where the depression creeps back in as the brain stabilizes and the concrete dries.
Right. So how did the addition of clinical hypnotherapy alter that long-term trajectory for these 89 individuals?
I mean, it fundamentally flattened the relapse curve.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
By actively utilizing that temporary neuroplastic window to plant new subconscious imagery, the psychological changes literally became biological structures.
So the hypnotherapy essentially provided a new architectural blueprint for the brain to follow as the concrete dried.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
When the ketamine was metabolized and the window of plasticity eventually closed, the brain did not revert to the old pathological DMN pathways.
It had a new shape.
Yes, it stabilized around the newly built, healthier neural connections. The new habits of thought took root permanently.
It is the difference between temporarily masking a symptom and fundamentally rewiring the operating system.
A complete paradigm shift.
It really is. When you look at the implications of these findings, it represents a monumental shift in psychiatric medicine. We are moving away from a model that merely suppresses symptoms with daily medication.
And moving toward a model that actively facilitates deep, targeted psychological reorganization.
It is curative in its ambition. It acknowledges that biological interventions require psychological context, and psychological therapies desperately need biological leverage to break through the armor.
It respects the sheer complexity of the human mind. Because when you honor both halves of the equation, the chemistry and the narrative, you achieve a synergy that neither approach could ever reach independently.
Think about the cauliflower fractals in your own mind, the rigid habits and self-models you've built on autopilot. If you had the right biological key and the right guide, what locked rooms in your own mansion would you finally be brave enough to open? It's incredibly hopeful to see how this combined approach doesn't just offer temporary relief, but actually helps patients rebuild their lives from the inside out and find a stable cruising altitude.
Exactly, Celine. By leveraging the biological window opened by ketamine and guiding it with hypnotherapy, we can help the brain rewrite its old models and foster long-term healing.
A beautiful reminder of the mind's capacity to heal. Thanks for listening to the Talking Ketamine podcast. We'll catch you on the next one.